All right. So for those who you don't know me, my name is Tyrell Forrest. I am Northern Pomo from Northern California, and I am the Sexual Assault Response Team Tribal Coordinator for Restoring Ancestral Winds. And I'm going to be presenting here with Nicoletta. Nicoletta, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. My name is Nicoletta Brown. I am the Community Training and Education Specialist at Restoring Ancestral Winds. I am Northern Arapaho from the Wind River Reservation located in central Wyoming.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Nicoletta, if you want to share your screen, and then we'll start going through the slides.
So it says I can't share my screen.
Oh.
Okay, I wanted to check on that. Let me see here. I thought it was set up already, but um, try it now. Yep. There you go.
All right, so this is obviously
Hold on.
the title of our training that we're going to be doing today. It's the barriers of Native survivors, and by us, the two names that you just got introduced to. So the objectives for our training today is we're going to go over just basically general information for us restoring ancestral winds. We're going to go over MMIR, which is missing murdered indigenous relatives. That terminology has changed a few times, so you may have heard it as missing and murdered indigenous women, missing and murdered indigenous people. MMIR is what we use, and which is the standard. But you'll often hear it other ways, just because that is, like many things in this realm, those kind of an ever evolving. But that's the best and most current descriptor. Then we're going to be going over understanding intergenerational trauma, the Indian Student Placement Program, which again people may or may not be familiar with, but that is something that is directly related to Native populations here in the Great Basin region, as we have had several Indian schools here. We're also going to go over some issues that affect Native victims and survivors, including jurisdictional issues, sovereignty issues, and ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act. And then finally, we're going to go over just some information around barriers that Native victims and survivors will run into when seeking services, and then some cultural competency and humility, and general support, and some tips and things to help support Native victims and survivors. So first things first, if you've heard of us, you've probably heard of RAW before, which stands for Restoring Ancestral Winds. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit based here in Sandy, Utah. But our mandate actually covers the entire Great Basin region, which is, I mean, basically it's every tribe in this region. So we actually extend over into Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, that kind of thing. And we assist both rural and urban populations. As a 501c3, we are obviously, funding, our operating funds are specifically mandated for tribal coalitions through the Office of Violence Against Women in the Department of Justice. And we are one of 20 sexual assault and domestic violence tribal coalitions in the US. Now, I do like to point that out, but also to let people know that that does not mean that we serve Native populations to exclusivity of everybody else. That is just our main goal, is to serve this specifically underserved community. So a little bit of, pardon me. So basically our entire purpose is to end violence in Native communities. And we work in both, like I said, rural and urban populations. So the needs and directions will change a little bit depending on the people that we're servicing. Real quick, let's just go over our team if you're not familiar with us. So this is our current team, and it is changing pretty, not a whole lot right now, but it has recently within the last 6 months. We've grown quite a bit. So our executive director is Yolanda Francisco. Many people in this field know her. She's been doing this work for quite a long time. Lita Baker is our operations manager. As I said, I am the SART travel coordinator. Alexis Black Mountain is our helpline coordinator. The helpline we did launch recently. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Nicoletta, who you met and who we'll be hearing from, is our community education and training specialist. And then the other person that you may speak with some regularity if you do reach out to us is Savannah Silversmith. She's our sexual assault, tribal advocacy, and outreach specialist. So she works directly with a lot of these tribal communities, especially this time of year, attending powwows and social gatherings and that kind of thing, just kind of getting our information out to the people who may need to access it. And then Cassidy Nez is our office assistant. And then as you can see, we have board of directors. They're really fantastic. And then we have a couple of consultants who work with us kind of just on a case-by-case basis. Like I said, so here's a little bit of history. So we've been around for about 10 years, and we are a nonprofit, non-governmental organization. We are Indigenous led and Indigenous staffed. So every person who works directly for RAW is a Indigenous person. Like I said, our funding is specifically mandated for tribal coalitions to assist tribal communities. But again, we do, assist wherever needed. And a big part of what we do here is training, which would be this next slide here. So that training, a lot of which Nicoletta focuses on, is training tribal agencies, victim advocates, tribal healthcare providers, who are on and around like reservation areas or in rural populations, but also here in the more urban populations in northern Utah. We also work directly with law enforcement, healthcare providers that are not Native specific, and do our best to work with all the federally recognized tribes that are in the Great Basin region. So this is some of the curriculum that we offer currently. So healing from trauma, and don't feel weird if you can't pronounce this actual, the Native terminology. We are a rainbow consortium of different tribes. So often what you'll see is going to be Diné or Navajo, because that is the largest population that we serve here. But please feel free to skip trying to pronounce those things if you're uncomfortable with them or don't know how to pronounce them when asking for any kind of training. We also work in human trafficking here in Indian country, interpersonal violence in Indian country, and then pathways to the missing and murdered. These are all things that we're going to be going over at our annual conference that is towards the end of this year on November the 4th. We also, in that training, we also are able to and willing to develop new training. For instance, this one here is an adapted training that we have given before, and we're able to adapt and change those trainings for specific groups of people. So for instance, if we're doing a training session like this for a tribal government, that's going to look different than if we are doing it for, say, a local sheriff's department, just based off of what needs they have and then what resources that they need more information about. And for instance, tribal government's already going to have a great deal of knowledge about, tribal members and interfamily and interpersonal relationships that say that sheriff's department won't have. So we can tailor these trainings. If that's something that you guys are interested in, please feel free to reach out to us after this. So as far as policy and advocacy goes, we do partner with state agencies to advocate for sexual assault and domestic violence victim services. We also aid in policy recommendations within tribal communities. So both on a tribal level, since they are sovereign nations, but also here at the state level. In 2023, the Utah legislative session, HB 490 was sponsored by Representative Ken Ivory, which proposed the creation of a statewide victim services coordination committee. And then we've also done work reviewing Navajo Nation legislation that's applicable to sexual assault and domestic violence, as well as working on basically any legislation that impacts SA and DV, victims and survivors. Again, not to the exclusivity of Native survivors, but if there is any bill, like for instance, the missing and murdered Indigenous people, we've had a couple bills. Last year was SB 480 that we worked on in conjunction with state government leaders as well. Alrighty, and then finally, this is a big one for us. This is mainly what we do is we provide policy research and technical expertise for tribes on intimate person violence, missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, general violence, tribal jurisdiction, and then healing and healthcare as well. Again, like I said, we do assist all the 8 federally recognized tribes in Utah. The way that we assist them does look different based on the population, but honestly, more it's regional. Rural tribal groups who live on or around the reservation will have different needs and different resources than somebody who lives, say, in downtown Salt Lake or Ogden or Provo or one of the larger city centers. And then we also do collaborate with both the Navajo Nation, Paiute, Shoshone, and the Goshute on federal policy and tribal code on domestic violence and sexual assault. The reason that we put that in there is this will kind of come to light more further in the training, but there is a pretty big disconnect between tribal leadership and the federal government and the state government. Again, like I said, that's something that we'll go over in just a bit, but those are all things that we work on. So if those are anything that you run into or have any questions about, please feel free to ask. And we will have a question and answer period here at the end of the training. Jorge did send me some questions that you guys had that we'll go ahead and answer. And if you do have any questions at the end at that time, we can go ahead and answer those as well. Nicolette is going to go ahead and take over for the next little bit, and then I'll be back with you.
So Restoring Ancestral Winds provides a free online training in partnership with the Aneth Chapter House, which is located in Aneth, Utah. The Shidduchima translates to me and my mom, and the goal of the Shidduchima is to end violence against women and girls, Navajo women and girls. This is a community-wide engagement process to build critical mass, catalyze conversation, foster alignment, and move together. Our next event is August 28th from 5 to 7, in person and online. You can RSVP me, or you can scan the QR code right here. We will be going over the Utah's MMIR Task Force 2023 report, which I will talk a little bit about here, but the training will go more in depth into that. So Restoring Ancestral Winds is a member of the MMIR Task Force. The Utah MMIWG Task Force was established in 2020. Then it was renamed to the Utah MMIR Task Force in 2023 to be more inclusive. Rai helped establish the MMIR Task Force report, and you can find it through the QR code or by searching restoringawcoalition.org. and the PDF will be right on the homepage. So what is MMIR? So this is a movement to end violence against Native women. It brings awareness to an issue that many face in our community. The acronyms can be expressed as MMIW, MMIWG, MMIP, MMIWG2S, or MMIX. There are a few symbols that are associated with the movement, and that is the red hand, the red dress, and the color red. The red hand represents the voices of the missing sisters or relatives not heard. It is often why you see it placed over the mouth, and it stands for the silence of the media and the law enforcement amid the crisis. The red dress is a reminder of the MMIR crisis. Some wear the dress and others hang the dress for others to see. It was started as an art installation in 2011 to bring awareness to the movement, and it has held the symbol ever since. The color red is known to be the only color that spirits can see, so it's hoped that by wearing the color red, we can call back the missing spirits of our women and children and relatives to lay them to rest. So the MMIR task force facts. So the Indigenous relatives face disproportionately high rates of violent crimes compared to other demographic groups. Native Americans make up 1.5% of Utah's population, but account for 5% of all murders in the state. But that is likely an undercount. Murder is the third leading cause of death among Native American women. The responsibilities of the MMIR task force is to include studying the scope and nature of MMIR in Utah and make recommendations for improvements in the criminal justice and social service systems for preventing and addressing crimes involving missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Utah. I'm going to pass it back over to Tyrell.
Alrighty, so this next part here is about the Native Heal helpline. It's this really amazing service that we got funding for just at the end of last year and launched in April, or I believe it was May actually of this year. And what it is a domestic violence and sexual assault helpline that, like RAW, is Native focus without being exclusionary in any way, but we provide Native specific referrals for domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, anything that goes along with those, including like economic abuse. There are also Native specific health services, like for instance, Sacred Circle. If you guys haven't worked with Sacred Circle, I would definitely look into them. They're an amazing program that's run by the Confederated Tribes of the Goshute. We also work really hard to specifically support Native victims and survivors with that Native lens. So being able to be conscious of cultural background, resources that they may or may not have access to, and because all of us here are Native, including Alexis, who runs our helpline, because we're all Native, we all have this, if not the same, similar lived experience, and similar intergenerational experience, that allows us, we feel, to be able to assist these victims and survivors in a way that maybe other people aren't able to do. So please go ahead and write that number down. You can also find all this information on our website, or you can reach out to UCASA. They have all of our information if you want to reach out to myself or to Nicoletta. We'd be happy to send you guys some flyers to put up anywhere that you may work, shelters, community centers, or even just to have a brochure available, for somebody whom you may run into. So another big thing that we like to really focus on is the LGBTQ plus and Two-Spirit community, which is a fairly robust group amongst many Native American communities. issues surrounding the LGBTQ plus, it's QIA. There are so many acronyms, and I mean, no offense if I forget or leave any of them out. But we like to stress that one of the reasons why this is important to us and why it's always a focus is because sentiments against that community are an entirely colonial concept, that was not something that was really even considered until colonization. And so many tribes across all of North America have 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 great respect, and people often from that community often hold positions of great honor, and they're considered very sacred in a lot of tribes. So unfortunately, that's one of the many issues that Native communities have run into um, due to colonialism. So that's something that we always try and provide extra focus for. So I just want that to be something that people are aware of. It's also something that's not super commonly known sometimes. So that's something perhaps that you can also maybe make yourself a little bit more knowledgeable about. Um, that's a whole other training, but that is something that you should definitely be keeping in mind when working with Native victims. Um, so we just have this quote here, kind of what we've been over already, but we are deeply invested in collaborating with tribal, county, state, and federal partners to end domestic violence and sexual assault in Native communities. And I think the biggest thing to take away from that is the word collaborating. Because this is such an underserved population, there's no way for any group, to solve this or even make a real dent without collaboration. And so that's something that we really try and focus on. We are worked really hard, especially over the last 6 months, since a lot of us are fairly new to this program, or to RAW in general. We've worked really hard to kind of stretch out our hands to anybody, and also to make an effort to go to build some bridges between service providers, victims advocates, police departments, and then other nonprofits like our sister organizations like UCAS and UDVC, because without that collaboration, without those partnerships, you really can't make the steps forward that need to be made to help. I mean, all underserved communities, but as this is the one that we serve, this one specifically. So for those of you that don't know, Utah is home to 8 federally recognized tribal nations, and they expand across, like I said, Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, but also up into Idaho as well. For instance, the traditional lands of the pardon me, of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation. So their tribal offices are in Ogden, but they were a slightly more nomadic branch of the Shoshone Nation, and when people were put on reservations, they were actually placed in Fort Hall, Idaho, for the most part. So many of the tribe, honestly, the majority of the Shoshone, the northwestern Shoshone, live in Idaho, up by Fort Hall. So, and it ranges from extremely small. For instance, the Skull Valley band of the Goshoot, who's out in Tooele County, most people don't even know they're there, and they have less than 180 enrolled tribal members. So they're a very small nation, which obviously leads to less resources, and honestly, just less of a footprint. And we serve all the way, this very small, tribal nation all the way up to the Navajo Nation, which is the largest tribal nation in the country. So we obviously we span a huge range of you know, tribal sizes and groups, and we have to address very different requirements and issues that those tribes may have. I actually always really recommend people go on to the Utah Division of Indian Affairs and check out the maps, because uh, there there are tribes and tribal communities across the state that some people just don't even know are there. Um, there are literally, like, in all we'll say four corners, even though Utah's a funky state. So in every corner of the state, um, you will find Native people. And just like everybody else, you know, when we're not in our home territories and home areas, there's a much larger concentration of Native people in large urban areas. So like I said, like northern Utah, um, down in St. George, and then, in the major cities. So like, Salt, pardon me, Salt Lake, Ogden, Provo, Orem, that kind of thing. So that's just a quick overview, but I definitely would suggest you go kind of take a look and see, see who's in your neighborhood, and see who you might be next to. The the other thing I really want to point out is that as a tribal coalition, for the Great Basin, we do our best to service um, every tribe that we work with in their own way and to their own needs. But something that I really cannot stress enough when working with people who maybe just don't have a lot of experience with Native individuals or tribal communities is that we are not a monolith. Native tribes can be similar, honestly, just based off of location, but they can also be vastly different. And it can have different languages, different cultural heritage, different origin stories. And that's something that we have to, ourselves have to work on pretty regularly. Like, for instance, neither Nicoletta nor myself are from a tribe in this region. I'm from Coyote Creek in Northern California, and she's from the Wind River Reservation, like she said. So while we were both native and both lived on reservations and have some similar lived experiences, there are some things that are just not the same in our tribes. Our languages obviously aren't. So keep that in mind, as best you can when you're working with Native individuals. Even, I mean, honestly, I would even say more importantly, when you are in an urban setting, because, you know, while a Native individual or an Indigenous person might have one experience when they, you know, born and raised and lived on the Uinta Ure Reservation, but they could also be Ute and have never been there and spent their entire life in Salt Lake, or spent their entire life in Seattle or something. So as is always the best bet in social work, do your best to avoid assumptions, but also keep that in mind, that being culturally aware of the the tribal communities around you is really your best bet, but also try and keep an open mind, which I know is a bit of an oxymoron when I'm saying, hey, keep in mind that everybody's different, but also we're similar. So that's on that one. You can move to the next slide, Nicola. Thank you. So I'm sure most people know this by now, but Indian is a political term and classification. It's not culturally appropriate to use, and can be very culturally offensive. Um, Unfortunately, and I mean, I'm just going to be totally blunt with you. Um, it's kind of like the N word, whereas, like, sometimes you'll hear Native people say it. We can, other people can't. Although for the most people, or for the most part, I have it kind of has become not culturally appropriate for anybody to use. Um, Most people prefer Indigenous, or First Nations, or Native. So just a heads up. But also that can be different too. A lot of Canadian tribes really only want to be called or be referred to as First Nation or their specific tribal group. Whereas a lot of people in the United States, I have noticed, just Native or Indigenous is fine. We're not super picky about it. But if you can refer to somebody as their tribe, if you're referring to them, in a generalization, that's really your best bet. Sorry, I just got a question here. I've noticed Indian is still used in legal documents and other legal terms. I always cringe when I find myself using those terms. Any guidance? Like the BIA. It's sure. Well, and there's the Utah Bureau of Indian Affairs is something that it's a government site still. Sandra, that's fantastic, and that is 100% correct. So Navajo is not what the Navajo people refer to themselves as. They refer to themselves as the Diné, as Navajo does have negative connotations. Diné means the people. Interestingly enough, that is a fairly common term. There's a couple tribes who are close to where I grew up, who in their language refer to themselves as the people. But yeah, there's Ariel, just to kind of to your question, I understand why it's cringy and there isn't great guidance for it. Honestly, use your best judgment when referring to something like the BIA, that's like an official, federal organization. I don't think anybody finds it particularly offensive. And then there are times that Native people will use it. We refer to, you know, areas with dense Native populations. Oftentimes we call it Indian country. There are podcasts run by Native people who refer to, Indian this or Indian that, which is, as I said, can be offensive and really shouldn't be used unless you yourself are Native. But yeah, I think that really is just use your best judgment. If you feel like you shouldn't be saying it, probably don't say it. And on that, Nicolette is going to go ahead and take back over for a little bit here. Good questions, though, guys. Please feel free to keep putting any questions in the chat.
You, Tyrell. So when I am using the word Indian, I will be using it as the political classification during this presentation. So here is a little timeline to help you better understand the history. So we must understand historical trauma to understand the issues of Native survivors. Historical trauma is the multi-generational, intergenerational trauma that refers to the legacy of traumatic events that are experienced by a specific cultural group that has a history of being systematically oppressed. One of the intergenerational trauma includes the boarding schools, the Indian boarding school history. So it began with the Indian Civilization Act and the peace policy that the US adopted, which they then adopted the boarding school policy, which intended to implement cultural genocide through reprogramming of Native American and Alaska Native children to accomplish systematic destruction of Native cultures and communities. The policy's purpose was to kill the Indian and save the man. And by 1926, nearly 83 of the Indian school-aged children were attending these boarding schools. By the 1900s, 20,000 children were in boarding schools, and then 1925, over 60,000 children were in boarding schools. There was 523 that were government funded, and the children were forcibly abducted by government agencies. Here's the boarding school era. So for over 150 years, 150,000 years of for 150 years, hundreds of Native children were taken or coerced away from their families and tribes. They were forced to attend government and religious-run Indian boarding schools. These schools were tools of colonization assimilation, and genocide, resulting in loss of land, language, culture, traditional foods, and permanent separation of children from their families. Survivors of boarding schools have described physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. The boarding schools targeted children who were the most vulnerable, and they experienced mental, physical, and sexual abuse. They were forced manual labor, neglect, and starvation, and death. Boarding schools was the US strategy to strip Native identities to disconnect the generation from their homelands. The use of boarding schools made the way for creating the US policies that infringed on tribal lands. So here are the boarding schools here in Utah. There is one boarding school and day school in Aneth that is still open today, but it's not a boarding school. It's now more of like a school, like just like a regular school. So the impacts of boarding schools, the boarding schools impacted individuals by the loss of identity, low self-esteem, no sense of safety. They were institutionalized and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The impact within families include loss of parental power and near destruction of extended family system. Tribal communities experience loss of the sense of community, language, and tribal traditions and ceremonies. Tribal nations as a whole experience weakened nations, structure, and depleted numbers and enrollment. The adoption era, so the BIA established the Indian Adoption Project in 1958, and it ended in 1967. The goal of the forced adoptions was to break Indigenous families apart and strip future generations of their ancestral lands, languages, teachings, and practices. By 1960s, 1 in 4 children lived apart from their families. The government agencies suggest that 25 to 35% of all children were stolen from their homes and communities, and of that, there was an estimate of 85% of those who were adopted by non-Native families to further the government's goal of assimilation. There were social workers that were enlisted to go onto the reservations and justify the removal of Native children. The Indigenous families were stripped of any rights to regain custody or even see their children. Another impact specific to Indigenous people in Utah is the Indian Student Placement Program, which was created by the Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints. The Indian Student Placement Program had 50,000 Native American participants. They were all children. This was an initiative sponsored by the LDS Church, in which the church members hosted Latter-day Saint Indian students during the school year. The program offered an educational and spiritual opportunities founded in the wake of World War II. The program enabled host families who were predominantly white Latter-day Saints to fellowship and assist American Indians. The federal Indian schools were underfunded and geographically inaccessible to Native children. Native applicants were at least 8 years old, in good health, and able to participate in school, and they were baptized as members of the church. In a 1981 study, many participants thrived, graduating high school and attending college at higher rates than natives who did not participate in the program. The Indian Student Placement Program peaked at 5,000 annual enrollments in 1970, but slowly declined. There were reports of sexual and physical abuse, and Indigenous activists began criticizing the Indian Student Placement Program as a tool of assimilation. The final participant graduated from high school in the year of 2000. Now we're going to talk a little bit about jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a little hard to understand, so I'm going to try to explain it as easy as possible. So Public Law 280 is the substantial transfer of jurisdiction from federal government to the states in an Indian country. Tribal nations dealt with an increased state authority and the state control over a broad range of reservation activities without tribal consent. The state of Utah obligates and binds itself to assume criminal and civil jurisdiction over Indians and Indian country, and the lands or any portion there within. So Utah is a optional state. They take some of the Public Law 280, but not the whole thing. So they do give the federal government some say in jurisdiction as well. Next is the General Crimes Act. It extended federal criminal jurisdiction over crimes committed in Indian country. It applies to cases where the offender is non-Indian, but the victim is Indian. It can apply to Indian offender versus non-Indian if the crime falls outside of the Major Crimes Act and the offender is not already been punished by the tribe for the offense. Now we're going to go to the Major Crimes Act, which provides federal criminal jurisdiction over certain crimes if the defendant is Indian. Exclusive federal jurisdiction over certain enumerated crimes include murder, assault resulting in serious bodily injury, and sexual offenses. Federal jurisdiction in which both the offender and the victim are Indians and the crime occurred in Indian country. The Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2023 recognizes the tribe's inherent power to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction over defendants regardless of their Indian or non-Indian status who commit acts of domestic violence, dating violence, and violence, or violate certain protective orders in Indian country. And then before a law enforcement can start investigating, they must answer some questions such as, is this a Public Law 280 jurisdiction? And then this can depend on if they have allotted reservation or if they're on surplus lands, where if the surplus lands were sold by the federal government or sold to the federal government, and then also has the demographic change of the de facto diminishment, which means it's not Indian country. And then also if is the alleged perpetrator Indian or non-Indian. And then the consequences of getting jurisdiction wrong is wrongful arrest if it's a law enforcement arresting somebody, and they can be sued for it. And then I did create a little chart to help you better understand how jurisdiction works. This is more of criminal jurisdiction for the Violence Against Women Act, which gives tribes the most jurisdiction. But any of the shaded areas is federal and tribe. All right, sovereignty is the right to self-govern. This includes the right to establish one's own form of government, determines membership requirements. They can enact legislation and establish law enforcement and court systems. This includes making decisions about their tribal members. The US Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments, and they have, with a few exceptions, the same powers as the federal and state governments to regulate their internal affairs. So there are 3 sovereigns in the United States, and it's the federal, state, and tribal governments. So next we're going to go over the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was enacted in 1978 in response to a large number of Native children that were being separated from their parents, extended families, and communities by state child welfare and private adoption agencies. The research found that 25 to 35% of Native children were being removed, and then of these, the 85 were placed with non-Native families. And then we also wanted to show you this video, which highlights the importance of ICWA. I don't know why it's saying I'm offline.
Hmm.
So
You're
y'all,
still,
am I still on Wi-Fi?
You're still on, I mean, you're still on the Zoom, so I would assume that, yeah, I mean, we have Wi-Fi still. Yeah, our Wi-Fi is still up.
Okay, I think I got it.
there's no audio right now.
What was that?
There's no audio.
Do you think you can fix your sound? Okay, let's try this again.
There we go.
My name is Rebecca Larson, and I'm a proud member of the Quinault and Quileute Indian Nation. I am a foster parent. I am a parent. I'm a grandparent. I'm a member of a beautiful community, the Swinomish, that is not my nation, but has become my home. There are elders here at Swinomish that I have sat with, and we've had this conversation about when, in the past, if a strange sedan pulled up on the reservation, our mothers hid our children. The scoop was the term that we use because the Children's Administration and other agencies were allowed to come into our tribal communities and literally scoop as many children as they could, take them quickly far from our reservations and place them for adoption. The practice didn't really stop until the early 80s. So this is not some faraway romantic idea of, oh, that was so long ago. My mother, Karen, was taken during that era from my grandmother, Myrtle. My grandmother, she had to go into the hospital for surgery. And while she was in the hospital, my mom and her siblings were taken. They separated them immediately and put them in separate cars. And my mother could remember driving away from the car that contained her sister and her brother. The Superior Court judge signed off on the paperwork within a matter of 4 days and said that my grandmother was morally unfit to raise her children. There was no explanation given. After her children were taken, some things never healed in her. She left the reservation. She was murdered on the streets of Tacoma. She was 38. My mother, Karen, went to live with this family. It was a very abusive home. She found herself pregnant with me at a very young age and was sent away. They still had Catholic-run schools for unwed girls. She was forced to sign papers to give me up for adoption, and she ran away from that place and never went home. She carried that brokenness with her out onto the streets, which is where she lived. She was unseen and unheard and never allowed to come home because of those systems that were in place to keep us from our communities. I was taken at birth and placed in a foster home, and I can remember the day my social worker came to collect me and take me to meet my prospective parents. I was not quite 4. I remember meeting these strange people, non-native folks. They oohed and awed over me, and in less than a week, my things were packed. It was the 70s, and there was no ICWA in place to protect me. My adoptive mother was very abusive to me physically. My adoptive father, he was very abusive to my mother. My going to 18 different schools was so that my father couldn't be found out. We moved to protect his abusive behavior. Moving to Swinomish was a moment of grace to be connected to a tribal community. And to people who I understood inherently, what really saved me in that situation was being able to talk to the youth director. And I shared with him the things that were going on behind closed doors in my home. And he and his family, they just took me into the fold of their family, because that's what we do as Indian people. We are tied to our culture in a way that I think is very different from other communities. You don't grow up with just your nuclear family, your immediate parents and your immediate siblings. In tribal communities, we grow up together in large extended families. Most adoptees who are not covered by ICWA and who are adopted out into non-tribal homes are not afforded that. That unsettled feeling, they don't even know what that is. It wasn't until I became connected to a tribal community that I understood. It had to do with my disconnection to our people. I think that my life would have been very different if ICWA had been available or in existence at the time of my forced adoption, being taken from my mother, and certainly would have changed my mother's life during the scoop era if it had been in place at that time to protect her, that she would have been placed with a family within our extended family. She would have stayed connected to our culture and to our people. For me, coming full circle, wanting to become licensed as a foster home is to keep our children connected to their communities so that they don't feel that strange, where am I? Who am I? Where do I come from? I didn't become a licensed foster parent in hopes to fast track adopt children. I have 2 boys in my care right now, little boys who are lost in the system. There are people longing for them to come home. When I tuck them in at night, we pray for their mom, and we pray that she can do the things that she needs to do. Because as a foster parent, your goal should always be reunification. The assault on our communities against our children, it continues today. When our children are lost, they languish in care. The disproportionality of the numbers of our children who are in extended care, who do not return home, are horrific and wrong. And ICWA is in place to protect us from that. Sometimes people say that the issue is too complex. And when I hear that word, I think about my mother dying. I think about my grandmother being murdered. I think about my great-grandparents. And I think about our ancestors that have prayed for us as children and as great-grandchildren and as far down as they could think ahead. What ICWA brings to our communities is the hope that our children are going to be connected to us and not lost to us forever.
Five words. You
So while there is progress that has been made through ICWA, out-of-home placement still occurs more frequently for Native children compared to the general population. Native families are 4 times more likely to have their children removed and placed into foster care than their white counterparts. For most of its history, ICWA has lacked an official oversight agency at the federal level, a national data collection and enforcement of authority. As a result, compliance with law enforcement has been uneven at best. The purpose of ICWA is to strengthen and preserve Indigenous communities and families and culture.
All right, you guys, before we move on to this next area, just because I know we are giving you a lot of information, and I'm sure some of you know some of it, some of you might know all of it. But does anybody have any questions or anything that you might have run into? You obviously are welcome to wait until the end, but I also just don't want anybody to have had a question and then forget it by the end and not have that question answered. So what we've gone over so far, specifically with like the Indian student placement programs, Indian schools, jurisdictional issues, sovereignty, or ICWA. Does anybody have any questions that are jumping to mind right now? You can go ahead and put it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask if you'd like. Okay, so looks like not yet. Again, we will have like a Q&A part here at the end for any questions that might come up. All of those things that we did talk about already obviously are extremely nuanced, and without doing, you know, a 2-hour training on each individual thing, we really can only scratch the surface of what those things actually are and how they have affected Native communities. Before I move on, there's one thing that I do want to kind of emphasize, and it's what that woman said in the video that we all just watched, is that this isn't some ancient practice. This isn't something that happened to us generations ago, or only generations ago. It's something that happened to us generations ago, but hasn't ever stopped. It's I have 2 cousins who were adopted out of our family before ICWA. I mean, and that was like the late 70s, you know, so it's not that long ago. You know, the Indian schools are still standing. I don't know if some of you guys might have been to one of the ones here in Utah. There's one just up in Brigham City that I went and visited that is, I mean, the area that it is now, but I mean, it's just something very intense about all of this. So before we move into, I think, trauma-informed care, which is quite notable, make sure that you are taking care of yourself here. If you need to take a break, it's totally understandable. If you need to excuse yourself, that's fine. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. A lot of times I know people are like, oh, well, it's not your job to inform us. We should inform ourselves. But that literally is why we're here today. So if you do have any questions, there's not a great, or there's really nothing that's like off limits. Please feel free to ask it, any question you might have, because if you can't ask it here, where can you ask it? You know, and we're happy to help in any way that we can. So but yeah, take some deep breaths, drink some water. Oh, thank you, Alexis. That's yeah, that's fantastic. Stephanie Benali is an amazing contact. And Alexis, if you wouldn't mind, if you could stick her contact info into the chat here. For those that you maybe didn't catch it, Alexis Black Mountain she's our helpline coordinator, so the helpline that I talked to you about earlier. So if you do have any questions about that, please feel free. You can reach out to her directly in the chat here, or obviously through our website as well. So we're going to go ahead and move on into this next section, which is trauma-informed care. I love trauma-informed care. It was a fairly new concept when I started in social work. And I actually started my social work career in homeless services. And so getting you know, quite a few trainings on trauma-informed care in general was really, really important to me and was really helpful. And if you haven't taken a direct trauma-informed care training, or just a generalized training, I would definitely recommend it, either through your agency, or again, you can reach out to us and we provide a trauma-informed care training that I myself actually do. for anybody who might not know, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is being informed, aware, and sensitive of the trauma that a victim or survivor that you are working with, or honestly anybody that you're working with, even your coworkers, but the trauma that other people have been through or may have been through, and how that's going to affect their actions, reactions, and how that should really kind of in tune you um to what your interactions with them should be like. Or at least, best practices. None of us is perfect. But there are a couple things to keep in mind in a trauma-informed care sphere when working with Native victims and survivors. And I know I keep saying victims and survivors. I know some people prefer one to the other or both. So please don't take offense if I slip up and only use one. I'm aware that that is different for everybody. So, but a big thing with Native people is a sense of self-awareness. There is a lot of history and almost ingrained racial stereotypes that people just don't even think about. Like the noble and ignoble savages, I was not even remotely offended by Peter Pan when I was a little kid, with the, noble savages didn't offend me at all. Dances with Wolves actually made me feel really good when I was like a teenager, because it was like, look, we're not being portrayed as ignorant or stupid. But even those where it's, portrayed as the noble savages, it can still be damaging. So just keep those things in mind. And there are stereotypes like the teary-eyed environmentalists, the actor who famously was in the anti littering campaign. He was not Native, he's an Italian guy that they, put a wig on and said, cry on camera and you'll make white people feel bad about littering. While alcoholism unfortunately does affect Native communities at a higher rate than any other community, having that ingrained, Native, even not even consider Native people drunks or drunken, but like, man, they just can't handle their alcohol. Not true. Some of us can, some of us can't, just like anybody else. However, the impacts in our community have been much higher. Same thing with living off the government, or the fact that like, Native people just get a free ride. I paid for all my college, most of us do. We don't get free money or free stuff just for being brown, and like every other lower socioeconomic group, it takes a lot more effort to succeed in a colonial landscape and to get a secondary or higher education. Was it 4 of the top 5 poorest counties in the country are on Native reservations? So when you already have these socioeconomic disadvantages, overcoming them is just that much harder. And then kind of the idea of the Indian princess or the Indian squaw, that is something that has been extremely detrimental and led to some of these massive upticks in missing and murdered Indigenous people. Being seen as some sort of exotic or interesting fantasy is hugely detrimental. And our you've seen this probably all over the internet, especially come October, where our culture isn't a costume and our culture isn't something to be fetishized. You should see me if I see a white influencer at Coachella wearing a headdress. I'm not thrilled about that. the concept of casino rich. Some tribes have casinos, some don't. And then even the ones that do, many tribes have blood quotient laws, which means that sure, you could live on the reservation, but not be able to receive any benefits from the tribal casino because, you know, you're not enough native. Assumptions that a lot of people make, just because there are unfortunately fewer of us, that we're vanished, that we just don't exist anymore. Like, sure, we may not, you may see a, tiger in a zoo, but there's not many in the wild, but that's just not the case. We live everywhere that everybody else lives. Sure, we have sovereign nations, but, I know many native people who have never stepped foot on their or any reservation and just live in urban areas or live in a rural area that is nowhere near a reservation. Like I said, you don't get a free ride just for being brown. And then just the stereotypes about any group of people that, because you saw it in a movie, we're stoic and don't have a sense of humor, or we're lazy, or inherently mystic for some reason. There are natives of every religion. You should see my friend Jesse. It's interesting to see him with braids and a yarmulke. So just keep that in mind, that we all have stereotypes, preconceived notions, and it's just best practices in any form of trauma informed care to do your best to think through those first and to think before you speak or act. Because the main goal of working in victims advocacy or in any kind of direct services especially is to avoid any kind of re-traumatization. You can't go back and prevent what happened to somebody, but you can definitely do your best to make sure you don't make it worse. And then this last one's a big one. And again, it can be divisive even in Native communities, that Native people overreact to our likenesses and names and things being used as mascots or celebrations or that kind of thing. Some people get really upset about it. Some people don't. But on the whole, I think it's best to avoid, fetishizing or the mascotification of anybody's culture. The Washington DC football team, the term Redskin is wildly racist. It was never something that Native people referred to ourselves or each other as. It is a derogatory term, specifically made by white settlers. So, maybe don't call your team that, or just be conscious of the issues that some people might take with things in your area. I know that there's the school in Bountiful that got, that people are all mad, like, oh, why do we have to change our name? Well, because your name's racist. And if a community is upset about it, then I mean, I think it's best to show respect, as best we can. Sure, there are compromises to be made, etc. And I'm sorry, that's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. So I do tend to go on a bit of a tangent on that one. So I apologize. No, it didn't go. Nope. There we go. Okay. Well, you went backwards, but that's fine. I'll just keep talking. Sorry, Nicoletta had to step out of her office. There we go. Okay. So some things to keep in mind with trauma-informed care when providing or recommending some sort of trauma-informed care to a Native victim or survivor, is that there are certain ceremonies that promote wellness. There are certain traditional medicines that Native people use in all forms of traditional healing to promote that wellness by acknowledging the interrelatedness of both our spirit and our creator and the universe around us that are not offered in many places, that are not offered, I mean, hardly anywhere really. There are community gatherings that are, I mean, most people have heard the term powwow. There's the gatherings that many of us grew up spending our summers going to. Many of them are every weekend you'd go to a different one or a different tribe's one, or you'd go to, regional dances, and they have, drumming groups and dance performances and competition and food, and there's all these different community building activities and community gatherings. There often are opportunities within those for interacting with traditional healers, storytellers who use prayer and drumming and songs and sacred objects that you really just, we don't have access to in many places. For instance, this is something I tell every service provider that I've worked with in this space, and I've taught this to law enforcement and to medical providers and sane nurses. It goes a really, really long way to have a bundle of sage or cedar for smudging or a sweetgrass braid. That may not seem like a lot to some people, but those things are very sacred to many, many native cultures. And the cleansing that we're able to give ourselves with those things is not only a personal healing for ourselves, but knowing that other people have thought enough about us or about our culture to have those on hand goes a long way. And it goes a long way to building trust. And that's the first thing that you need when working with victims and survivors is some form of trust. They can't trust you, you're never going to be able to get through to actually help them. And then respecting sovereignty, understanding an individual's needs obviously is important working with anybody, but understanding a specific community's needs and then understanding perhaps your own implicit biases, right, will help you to build and maintain that trust, as I said. And one of the things that you'll notice is, man, we're funny as hell. Native people use humor to heal a lot. You kind of have to have a pretty good sense of humor to go through what we've gone through for as long as we have. So again, don't think that just because you saw a stoic old native man in a movie, well, no, we mostly just joke. So the next part here is going to be barriers when seeking services. And a lot of it is kind of interconnected with what I was just talking about, like lack of culturally informed care, not just physical healthcare, not just care at medical centers or through SANE exams or things of that nature, but also like mental health care, being able to see a medicine person, being able to get smudged, being able to feel like you're the culture that you've grown up with is a part of your healing process. And there's historic mistrust in mainstream services, especially law enforcement traditionally, but also there's a historic distrust in the medical field. For a very long time, when Native women would go into get any kind of surgery, they were forcibly sterilized. So if you go in to get your tonsils out and you come out not being able to have kids anymore, that tends to build in some historic distrust and trauma. So keeping those things in mind when helping victims and survivors is really important, and knowing those barriers, knowing that history of violence. And then there's things that we do share, across cultural, like the fear of not being believed, stigma and shame of being a victim of violence, having to be self-reliant, due to, lack of family or extended family units for, many, many reasons. And then again, uncertainty about services that you might receive. And then this is a big one, is geographic challenges. Unfortunately, when Native people were forcibly relocated, we weren't given the nicest, most convenient tracts of land to live on. So because we were stuck out in often desolate and distant areas, there are significant geographic issues to just receiving basic care, let alone specialized care for something like sexual assault or domestic violence. So this next other direction, there we go, is cultural competence and humility. I don't ever want that to come off as I don't trust your competency or that I don't think people are humble, but that's just what it is. That competence refers to the efforts that people recognize and understand the traditions and belief systems, or at least try, at least try to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, so to speak, or at least understand where somebody might be coming from. The goal is obviously to use knowledge about that culture that you get from this training or any other training that you might receive, or just asking questions, just doing the work, and allowing that work and that knowledge to actually inform how you interact, and being able to let go of those biases that you may have had that you may not even know you have. So cultural humility is being aware of the innate power imbalances and biases. Now, there are automatically those imbalances and biases between people who are providing care and people who are receiving it. That's just across the board. You get that from anybody. But with the additional issues people in Native communities have experienced, and these additional traditional lack of resources and barriers in seeking services adds an extra layer. So having that awareness of that imbalance and the biases that these people are going to have, not just based off their own lived experience, but based off of 200 years of intergenerational trauma and traumatic history. And like I said, there are ways to practice that kind of cultural humility and competency. Those are super important, but engaging in that self-reflection is one of the best things that you can do for yourself, just in life in general. Be honest when you're not sure about something. Just ask, because it's better to ask and maybe feel ignorant for a second and then have that information for the rest of your life than not ask and be ignorant for the rest of your life. Learn about other cultures. You're doing that right now, and I 100% applaud you all for being willing to take this kind of training. I know that this can be very uncomfortable. No one gets it right all the time, and you're not going to. You're gonna mess up. I mess up daily. In fact, probably more than most people. But trying is the key part, and trying in the face of discomfort, or I'll be honest, shame. I've had people tell me that before. They've come out to me after trainings and been like, I'm so ashamed for what, historically what people of my race have done to people of your race. I understand that. It's often the hardest thing to do, is to get over that shame and recognize that you are doing your best. You are here. You're taking this training. This is important that you're doing this. And I get it. I do. I'm half Native. I'm the other half. My mom immigrated here from Ireland, so I'm a weird mixture, and so that has caused some, turmoil in my own life. So I get it. But the fact that you're here and doing this work is what's most important. You do the next one, Nicolette. This is the best way to support Native survivors. Show up and keep showing up. Trust within the Native community is going to be one of the hardest things that you're going to have to work at if you work with Native people regularly, because not only are there already issues of trust with sexual assault and domestic violence. But like I said, there are these layers of historical distrust and trauma. So just keep showing up. Show that you care by being there. Show that you care by asking questions respectfully, meeting the survivor where they're at as best you can. Obviously, ensure they feel safe and heard, like with any survivor. And like with any survivor, don't force anything on them. Even if you know, quote unquote, know that it's in their best interest or think it's in their best interest, you know, go at their pace. It's their healing, you know. And then do your best to provide culturally sensitive care. Again, if you don't know, ask, you know, and there may be a question that you ask, like, hey, would you like some sage, that they might not have even considered because no medical provider they've ever been to has had that option or has given that to them. So, and then understand that Native survivors' healing process is going to, probably not might look different, is going to look different than anybody else. Just like any other specific community, their healing process is going to look different, and you'll have a good idea of what that might look like based off of this training, what the traumas that they might have been through that they might not even talk to you about. They might not talk to you about anything other than the assault that you're working with them for, but know that they have this historical and intergenerational trauma hanging over their heads as well. So we want to send you or give you guys a list of some resources here. And then after this, we'll have some contact info for us here at RAW and that helpline. Let's go ahead and leave this up here for a minute. And then at the end, there is a QR code to do a survey. If you don't mind, that would be fantastic. We would love it. Our grant loves, our grant providers love to get survey data from us. So that would be very helpful if you guys wouldn't mind doing it. But let's go ahead and ask if anybody does have any questions right now. Nicoletta, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself. And if anybody else that may have an answer that we don't, or that you're like, oh, hey, I know this, or I know this person, please feel free to chime in. You know, like I said, building bridges is the best thing we can do in this community and in this work. So. And I don't know where you guys are, but it is storming like crazy outside here in Sandy. It's really pretty, but it's coming down like cats and dogs. Oh, okay, sorry. So there is the QR code right there in the corner to do the survey. Yeah, there you go. Say, hey, I'm happy to talk about rain as much as anybody else. I'm from like I said, I'm from the West Coast. I definitely miss having thunderstorms off the ocean. So this I'll take this any day over, you know, the 110-degree heat we've been having. And I do want to let everybody know that because we are yes, thank you, Alexis. Yeah, we're happy to drop off or deliver any kind of brochures or flyers for our helpline. We also have, you know, other you know, materials. And I want you guys to know that we do trainings, like I said, on everything from teen dating violence, red flags and green flags in dating. And then we are a resource outlet, basically, with the exception of Alexis and our hotline. We are not direct client facing. Our job as a coalition is to do our best to help service providers and tribal communities make connections and find resources. But we don't provide any direct service. It's very, very similar to UCASA. We don't provide direct service care. We do a lot of trainings and that kind of thing. If nobody else had any other questions.